But until you've been through a bankruptcy, it's hard to wrap your head around what it actually means. Because a lot of people use the term bankrupt as this term that's synonymous with failure or giving up or throwing in the towel. And it basically equates to losing everything and starting over and living in a cardboard box on the side of the road somewhere. I don't think people really realize that you can file for Chapter 13 bankruptcy and be back on your feet in a couple of years and still pay all your bills in those couple of years. You might not have credit. Your credit score is going to be terrible. But if you talk to almost every very successful person, almost all of them have been bankrupt at least once in their 20s or 30s. Um, a business coach that I used to work with that currently owns a very large commercial remodeling company, doing like multiple 8, 9 figures. I can't remember the exact number, but he went bankrupt twice, once in the 90s and once in 2008, and is now very successful. But as the old saying goes, the good lessons are expensive and the best lessons are really expensive.
Hmm.
So
Man, that's awesome. And I think from this conversation, I think we can learn a heck of a lot of lessons. If you don't mind being our little guinea pig, this is going to be pretty interesting. Because I think a lot of people in the entrepreneur space, you like Jason puts it, there's this pressure of like the grind, like just keep grinding away and you will find success. And I think sometimes people they get on the wrong side of that, right? They get too much debt to income, like too much debt to income ratio, too much payroll to income ratio, overhead. And so I would love to kind of dig into some of those so that maybe we could set up some red flags for people that are maybe going down that
mhm.
path and they don't even know it. Like, do you have, I mean, it's kind of a crazy question and it might be hard to quantify, but do you have, what's your take on debt coming out of this being overwhelmed with debt? And what would you say is like a healthy debt to income ratio, if any? Like, like, how would you do it if you did it again with debt
Yeah.
specifically?
So what I would tell you is two things. I would say one, I'm still a very firm believer that responsibly used and leveraged debt, if used appropriately, is absolutely necessary and good in business. However, what I learned is that what I defined as responsibly used and leveraged debt was not.
Hmm.
So I'll give you an example. If you're starting a new company and you have no revenue and you take out a $50,000 loan to buy a new truck, it's probably not very responsible. I think everybody knows that. Everybody knows that you shouldn't be driving a $100,000 truck if you can't afford the $2,000 a month payment.
Hmm.
On the business side of things, I think there's a big disconnection between using debt for things that directly make you money and using debt for things that you want and you can kind of quote unquote justify as being needed in your business. I'll give you a great example. In my old company, we bought a Bobcat. It's a $40,000 piece of equipment, but we bought it because over a period of about a year, we were paying $2,000 a month on average in rental fees to rent a Bobcat.
Hmm.
That Bobcat, when I bought it, was on a 5 year term and the payment was $800 a month. So that means that every month that we're not renting that machine, we're actually saving $1,200 and we're building equity in a piece of machinery that we actually own instead of paying some rental companies overhead. That is a perfect example to me of something that is a good use of debt in a business. But
Hmm.
if you're a fencing company that could just as easily buy a $500 gas powered auger instead of a Bobcat to drill fence post holes, it's
Hmm.
probably not a justifiable expense. Another good example is if you're a handyman who's brand new and you have a truck or a van that works, but you want to buy a brand new van because you want to look more professional for customers, you could argue that's a good use of money, but you could also argue that waiting a year or two until you have more money or until you've saved up enough to pay off half or all of that vehicle up front instead of going into debt over it would be a better decision.
Hmm.
A good example in my company now is I have a credit line in my new company that somehow I still have, even though I'd filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago. But
Hmm.
that credit line has been active for 6 months and I haven't touched it. The only reason I have it is so that if I ever ended up in a situation where I needed money emergently to pay payroll or to do something else in the company, I know that I wouldn't be out of business over something that could be resolved by borrowing a few $1,000s.
Hmm.
That being said, people use credit lines for the craziest things. I mean, I knew a guy a couple of years ago who had $100,000 in working credit that he could borrow from whenever he wanted, and he would borrow from it and pay it off in the same week, basically every week, because he had to buy so much materials up front for jobs. But it took him a couple of years to have enough money saved up in the bank to actually be able to do that in cash. So that credit line allowed him to operate his business. Another great
Hmm.
example is net 30 accounts. So if you're a guy that all you do is build decks like I used to, I used the heck out of my net 30 account at my lumber yard because I could file a contract for a $50,000 deck with $20,000 in materials, take a deposit for half of that project up front. That deposit would sit in the bank. I would buy those materials on credit, but I didn't actually owe the lumberyard that money until those materials were delivered to the job site. So during that 2 or 3 weeks that I had quote unquote paid for that lumber, if the customer canceled the project or something happened, I could return it, and then that money is still sitting in my account and it can be returned to the customer instead of having to jump through all these hoops of I got to return the materials, then I have to get my cash back, then I have to wait for processing, then I can issue a refund. So you still have that money sitting in your account, but that lumber that you purchased is on credit instead of in cash, especially if it hasn't been delivered or hasn't actually been used yet. It just makes the financials of operating that kind of company a lot simpler.
Hmm.
Or another example is in my current company, I have a net 30 account at our chemical supplier. It only racks up three, four, five, $600, $700 a month. It gets paid off on the first of each month. But it means that instead of every one of my employees having to pay $20 here, $50 here on the company card, it's one bill per month. So instead of having 50 transactions on my accounting, there's one. And I know
Hmm.
that we have the money in the bank to pay that off every month. But there's so many different kinds of debt and there's so many different uses of it that I feel like a lot of business owners get into trouble because they borrow money in the hopes of growing, expanding, or improving their company. And what they really do is just give themselves another payment each month, and it doesn't really move the needle. I think at the end of the day, you can summarize all of that with one litmus test, which is if the money you're borrowing, you can directly show that it makes you more money, then it might be a decision worth considering. Doesn't mean it's the
Hmm.
right decision, but if buying a piece of equipment or buying materials or buying something with leveraged debt means that you directly use that thing to make more money and it's still responsible and you know that you're going to have the money to pay it back, then it might be worth considering. But at the end of the day, so much debt that people borrow is with this hope and idea that it's going to actually make the money and it really doesn't do anything. It just
Hmm.
puts them in a hole.